The darkness of space had never felt so alive. The Astral Horizon glided through the vast ocean of stars, its engines humming like a restless heart. Inside the command deck, a blue glow bathed the metallic walls and illuminated the tired faces of the crew. Captain Elara Voss sat with her back straight and eyes sharpened to icy points, a calm veneer masking the exhaustion that weighed on her like lead. A sharp beep pierced the room. Lieutenant Rom's head snapped up from the holographic display, the shifting lights casting shadows across his high cheekbones and hollow eyes. His usually methodical demeanor slipped as he leaned closer, fingers flying over the controls to isolate the source of the interruption. The console responded, unfolding streams of data across his screen, a mess of numbers and static that made no sense. But beneath it all, something pulsed. "Captain," Raum said, barely above a whisper, as if any louder, and the thin thread holding the room's sanity would snap. "The signal's back." The crew went still. Elara felt her chest constrict as she nodded for him to amplify the transmission. Speakers crackled to life, spilling a chaos of sound, like 1,000 dying breaths trapped within metal walls. The noise seemed alive, writhing through the air like an unseen parasite. Then, amidst the chaos, a voice emerged. At first, it was little more than a low rumble, a guttural scraping that twisted the air in the room into something oppressive. But as they listened, the words sharpened like a knife edge. "It is not dead. It waits." A silence, heavy and unnatural, followed. The kind of silence that swallowed you whole and made your thoughts feel loud. Elara's gaze swept over the crew, finding their faces bathed in the wavering glow of the console, eyes wide with horror. Rom's hand trembled on the controls. Dr. Kyle, standing by the door with an untouched cup of something cold in his hand, looked as though the blood had drained from his body. Elara's voice came out steady, honed by years of crisis, but it took all her strength to manage it. "Triangulate the source." A murmur of clicks and swipes followed as Raum executed the command. Probes deployed, mapping the empty sea of stars, analyzing and calculating with an indifferent precision. The screen pulsed, and an alert pinged. "It's the Lamia," Raum said, barely audible. The name hit the room like an explosion. The Lamia, a ghost ship that haunted the dreams of spacefarers. Decades ago, it had disappeared, swallowed whole by a stretch of uncharted void, leaving only fragmented distress calls and whispered legends in its wake. The rumors spoke of a crew that had discovered something impossible and paid the price with their sanity, then their lives. Dr. Kyle finally set his cup down, his fingers clenched so tightly that his knuckles were bone white. "Captain, if it's the Lamia, we need to reconsider. We've already answered its call," Elara said, gaze locked on the screen as the final coordinates appeared. The numbers, cold and indifferent, marked a region of the galaxy known only by its survey code. B9X18, an abyss of drifting rock and uncharted space. "And we're not turning back now." The ship changed course, its engines humming as it prepared for the leap into hyperspace. The bridge remained silent, the crew exchanging glances, heavy with words they couldn't say out loud. As the familiar star lines stretched across the windows, Raum thought he saw something shift in the distance, a smear of darkness that didn't move with the usual rhythm of space. He blinked, and it was gone, but a cold dread coiled in his gut. Seconds later, the Astral Horizon vanished into the slipstream, chasing the echo of a long-dead call. The slipstream tore them from reality, a turbulent ride that twisted the light into a kaleidoscope of blurred blues and whites. Moments later, with a bone-jarring thud, the Astral Horizon dropped back into normal space, skidding into the star-speckled silence of B9X18. The crew collectively exhaled, the hum of the engine settling into a steady, familiar rhythm. But the reprieve was short-lived. In the vastness outside, debris hung like a silent witness, a skeletal assembly of asteroid fragments and twisted metal that drifted in lazy spirals. At the heart of it, bathed in the weak light of a distant, dying star, loomed the carcass of the Lamia. Its hull was a monstrous silhouette, pockmarked and clawed, bearing scars of battles fought and mysteries unanswered. Deep gashes, blackened as though burned by an unholy fire, marred its surface. The ship was vast, larger than the Astral Horizon, and seemed to crouch in the starlit gloom, as if waiting. The bridge crew stared at it in silence, the hair on the back of their necks prickling. Captain Elara Voss rose from her chair, the subtle creak of her uniform breaking the tension like a gunshot. "Prepare the landing party. We're going in." The docking maneuver was meticulous. The Astral Horizon eased toward a jagged rent in the Lamia's side, the remnants of its hull like shattered teeth. Clamps extended, hissing as they locked into place with metallic thunks that reverberated down the length of the ship. Raum stood by the hatch, checking his gear, trying to ignore the chill that had settled in his bones. The others followed suit, murmuring terse confirmations into their comms. The hatch slid open, revealing a chasm of darkness that seemed to swallow their helmet lights. The air in the breach was stale, heavy with the scent of rust, and something sweetly metallic that clung to their senses. Elara stepped forward, leading the way with the assured stride of someone who had long since silenced her doubts. The rest followed, boots clanging on the grated metal floor. The corridor yawned before them, a skeletal ribcage of steel and shadows. Here the passage of time had left its fingerprints, frozen, mummified crew members in suits that crumbled at a touch, eyes wide and glassy with a terror that seemed fresh. A few meters ahead, a twisted mass of wires hung like veins, swaying gently as if disturbed by a breath that didn't belong to them. "Spread out," Elara ordered, her voice amplified in their helmets. "Raum, you're with me. Kael, keep the rear covered." They moved cautiously, sweeping their beams over the walls etched with cryptic, claw-like gouges. It was Raum who first noticed the marks weren't random. His heart sank as he traced the symbols with the beam of his light, distorted faces contorted in silent screams, etched in patterns that told stories he could not comprehend. "Captain, you need to see this," Raum said, trying to keep the tremor from his voice. Elara's eyes narrowed as she approached, her light joining his. The symbols seemed almost to shift, to breathe under their scrutiny. Before she could respond, a thump echoed from deeper within the ship. The sound rippled through the floor, a vibration that felt unnervingly like the beating of a colossal heart. It came again, louder this time, followed by the faint scrape of something dragging across metal. "Everyone, stay alert," Elara said, fingers tightening around her rifle. Her tone was calm, but Raum could see the pulse quickening in her neck. The light beams swung wildly as a sudden noise erupted, metallic and sharp. A high-pitched screech followed by silence that pressed on their eardrums. Dr. Kyle's breath quickened behind them. "Did anyone see that?" he whispered, eyes wide and locked on a side corridor where shadows moved as if alive. A low thrum passed through the walls, an electric shiver that made their hair stand on end. Then, out of the corner of Elara's eye, movement, a skittering blur, quick and too many-limbed to comprehend. She pivoted, weapon raised, as a flash of sleek, chitinous plating disappeared into a hatchway. Raum swore, eyes darting as he scanned the passage for any other signs of life. The hollow silence was now saturated with their shallow breathing and the pounding of their hearts. "We're not alone," Elara said, her voice a razor-edge whisper. And then, as if mocking her words, a deep groan rumbled through the ship, louder than before, like the resonance of a colossal organ being plucked. The sound dragged on, vibrating through their bones, until a distinct click-clack of multiple limbs tapping against metal floors echoed from every direction. Before they could react, the emergency lights along the walls flickered, bathing the corridor in crimson that pulsed in sync with the haunting thrum. And in that stuttering red light, the darkness moved, shifting to reveal glistening eyes, multifaceted and hungry, watching them with an intelligence that chilled them to their cores. The corridor was a tomb wrapped in red pulses of emergency light, illuminating the thin veil of dust swirling with each step. Captain Elara Voss took slow, deliberate breaths, her senses sharpened to a needle's point. The silence was not truly silent. It was thick, humming with an oppressive resonance that filled the ears with whispers, just out of reach. Somewhere deeper in the ship, the metallic click-clack of unseen limbs moved in rhythm with the crimson flashes. Lieutenant Raum was beside her, jaw clenched, eyes darting to every shadow that stretched too long or shifted where it should have stayed still. Dr. Kale brought up the rear, a hand quivering around his plasma pistol, eyes glazed with a mixture of fear and clinical detachment that came from years of stitching up wounds in war zones. But this was different. This was not a battlefield. It was a predator's lair. They reached a junction where the corridor split into three. A jagged sign, half collapsed and rusted, pointed left to the command center, right to engineering, and forward into a black maw labeled Habitation Deck. Elara took a step forward, then froze as a distant thud resounded, followed by the hiss of air escaping through unseen cracks. The pulse in her ears thundered as the noise resolved into a wet, dragging sound. "Left! To the command center!" she ordered, voice taut like a bowstring. Raum and Kyle nodded, boots silent against the grated floor as they moved as one. The command center was a cavernous room dominated by shattered glass panels and consoles that flickered dimly, struggling with the last gasps of power. The smell of ozone and decay was thick here, mixing with a scent that was more primal, almost coppery. The room was an eerie memorial. Bodies slumped over terminals, the reflections of their open, staring eyes locked into the cracked screens. Their contorted faces spoke of a death that had come swiftly and mercilessly. Raum stepped forward, and the crunch beneath his boot snapped the tension. He glanced down to see brittle shards of something that wasn't glass. Bone, small and delicate, like fingers. "I don't like this," Raum said, his voice a thread of sound. Elara ignored him, focusing instead on the central display, a static-filled screen that flickered in bursts. She tapped at the console, coaxing the logs back to life. Fragmented videos and audio files played on a loop, showing glimpses of crew members, eyes wide with terror, and voices shouting over the blare of alarms. "Keep working on that," she said, eyes narrowing at the repeating fragments of garbled distress calls. Raum nodded, his hands shaking as he worked the console, muttering the litany of a man on the brink of panic. Kale moved to inspect the bodies, searching for signs of what had happened. The dragging sound came again, louder this time. It was closer, slithering like a thick, wet rope over metal. Kyle stood, gaze snapping to the hallway behind them. The crimson lights flickered, shadows surging forward before receding like a taunt. "Elara," Kyle said, but there was no time. The ceiling vent above them buckled with a sharp, metallic clang. All three froze, eyes snapping upward as the vent cover quivered, then fell with a deafening crash. Something dropped through, fast and sinuous, landing with a force that sent vibrations across the deck. The creature was a nightmare sculpted in chitin and muscle, limbs folding and unfolding in a dance of predatory elegance. It moved in sudden, insect-like jerks, its slick black exoskeleton glistening under the emergency lights. Eyes, clusters of them, blinked with a sentience that didn't belong in the natural world. They darted over the crew, assessing, deciding. "Run!" Elara's shout jolted them into motion as the creature lunged, a blur of jagged limbs and clicking mandibles. Raum ducked just as a whip-like appendage sliced through the space his head had occupied. He hit the floor hard, adrenaline turning the pain into a distant memory. Kale stumbled back, raising his pistol and firing a frantic volley. The shots glanced off the creature's armor, leaving scorched streaks, but little more. It screeched, a piercing, inhuman sound that rattled their skulls and filled the room with a vibration that felt almost alive. It pivoted with a grace that defied its size, seizing Kale by the leg and yanking him upward. "Elara!" Kale's scream split the air as the creature's claws punctured his suit, black veins spreading under the skin, a horrific map of infection racing through his body. He convulsed, eyes rolling back as the creature tossed him aside like refuse. Elara grabbed Raum by the collar, dragging him to his feet as the creature rounded on them. Its eyes locked onto her, a glimmer of intelligence in their dark depths that promised an end far worse than death. They bolted down the corridor, the sound of scuttling limbs and Kyle's fading screams echoing behind them. The lights dimmed further as they ran, plunging the ship into an uneven, pulsing darkness. The walls seemed to close in, and the thrum of the creature's pursuit resonated through the metal like a drumbeat of doom. Elara risked a glance over her shoulder and saw it, moving fast, limbs folding and expanding, eyes never leaving its prey. There was no escape, only the tightening spiral of the hunt, and they were at the center of it. The darkness pulsed as if breathing. The Lamia's narrow corridors wound on, twisting deeper into the bowels of a ship that felt more like a tomb with each passing second. Captain Elara Voss's heart drummed a frantic, erratic rhythm in her chest, each beat drowned out by the relentless, skittering thrum of the creature's pursuit. The emergency lights had dimmed to little more than blood-red glows, flickering spasmodically and painting the rusted walls in shifting waves of crimson. Raum stumbled behind her, gasping for breath, the ragged edge of his panic palpable. He looked back and caught a glimpse, just a flash of movement, glistening black limbs slicing through the air, a grotesque dance that betrayed an unnatural grace. His voice came out strangled, half sob, half whisper. "Elara, it's here." "I know," she said, voice hoarse, each syllable like dragging iron across stone. She didn't look back. The weight of knowing what waited behind them was enough. Seeing it again would root her to the spot with terror. They rounded a corner, feet slipping on the slick metallic floor. A burst pipe hissed, spewing out freezing mist that curled around their legs like ghostly tendrils. Raum shivered violently, the cold gnawing at him, but the icy grip was nothing compared to the chill of dread consuming him. Ahead, the corridor split, each path a different shade of shadow, but none promising safety. Elara hesitated, eyes darting between the left and right passages, trying to map out the ship's maze-like structure from memory. The pounding steps of the creature behind them made the decision for her. She grabbed Raum's arm and yanked him to the left, deeper into the dark. The sound of their boots echoed in a staccato, the rhythm of their flight broken by the unnatural, skittering clicks that followed. The creature's pursuit was relentless. It moved with a purpose, as if it had known they would be here, as if this moment had been written long before they'd arrived, sealed in the dust and decay of the Lamia's long silence. Raum stumbled again, this time crashing into a rusted bulkhead that gave a groan of protest. He collapsed to the floor, gasping as pain flared through his knee. Elara spun around, eyes wide with something that hovered between desperation and defiance. The darkness behind them shifted, a ripple of black that resolved into the glistening form of the hunter. "No, no, no," Raum gasped, scrabbling backward as the creature emerged into the weak light. It was massive, a kittenous horror with limbs that twisted impossibly and eyes that glistened like polished obsidian. It tilted its head, the clicking of its mandibles a dreadful song of hunger and malice. Elara raised her rifle, the last in a long line of futile gestures. Her finger tightened on the trigger, and the corridor exploded with searing plasma flashes. The creature flinched, a ripple of motion across its exoskeleton, but it did not retreat. It advanced, a tide of glistening black and bone-white eyes. Raum screamed as the creature struck, its limbs whipping out in a blur. He was pulled into the air, legs kicking, fingers clawing at empty space as he was wrenched toward the rows of teeth glistening beneath the creature's eyes. Elara took a step forward, instinct driving her to reach for him, even as a voice in the back of her mind whispered that it was too late. Raum! The name was ripped from her throat, a plea, a protest against the inevitable. Raum's scream cut off as the creature's limbs constricted, and then there was only the wet sound of flesh giving way. Elara staggered back, bile rising as the creature's gaze met hers, the intelligence in its multifaceted eyes a promise that her time was coming. But it didn't lunge. It held her gaze for a moment, long enough for a chill to seep into her bones, before dragging Raum's lifeless form into the dark recesses of the ship. The silence that followed was suffocating. Elara stood frozen, rifle still raised, though her hands shook so badly she could barely keep hold of it. She was alone now, alone in the hollow heart of a ship that had become a monument to death. A shuddering exhale escaped her, and she forced herself to move, the echo of Raum's last scream chasing her down the corridor. The Lamia shifted around her as if alive, groaning metal and the hiss of unseen mechanisms. The emergency lights flickered, weaker now, painting the walls with less light and more shadow. She pushed on, each step a battle, muscles coiled with the knowledge that death was always just behind her. A sound, a soft, skittering noise echoed from the corridor ahead. Her breath hitched, eyes wide, searching the dark for movement. But it was not the creature. This sound was smaller, fainter, a series of clicks and scrapes that spoke of something broken and desperate. She followed it, driven more by the refusal to stand still than by hope. The corridor widened, opening into what once must have been the habitation deck. It was a graveyard now, filled with twisted remnants of life. A child's toy, a battered shoe, a chair that swayed gently as if disturbed by a passing ghost. And in the center, a console blinked weakly, its light barely fighting against the dark. Elara's fingers brushed the controls, and a message began to play, broken and full of static. The face on the screen was gaunt, eyes hollow, speaking words that came in and out, as though time itself fought against its telling. Not dead. Waits beneath. We thought we found, but it found us. There's no escape. The recording dissolved into noise, the face lost to static. But the message was clear. The truth had been waiting here long before them, patient and insatiable. A shadow passed over the room, and Elara knew she was out of time. The hunter was here, its limbs clicking as it moved, no longer content with the game of pursuit. Her heart thundered as she faced the entrance, rifle raised, muscles locked in the final defiance of the hunted. The darkness shifted, and the creature loomed, eyes glistening with triumph. In that moment, Captain Elara Voss knew there was no escape, only the inevitable end that waited beneath the stars, in the forgotten places where light did not touch. The last thing she saw was the glint of those eyes and the cold, unfeeling sweep of its limbs as it surged forward, and the light finally gave way to dark. Back on the bridge of the Astral Horizon, the signal repeated itself, an echo lost in the silence of the void. It is not dead. It waits. And outside, the stars, indifferent and eternal, watched it all.